Ethan Ward pulled up in front of the sign that read, "Welcome to Clearwater," his hand tightening around the letter his mother had sent before she passed. The handwriting was shaky, the message short, "Don't dig under the apple tree." 7 years in the service had taught him how to face gunfire, but nothing had prepared him for the distant look in his boy's eyes or the low murmurs in town about a crime long buried. As the daylight faded, Ethan gripped a shovel, knowing whatever waited for him beneath those roots wouldn't just change him. It would tear Clearwater apart. The inner-city bus dropped him off in a small gravel lot on the edge of Clearwater, just as the sky slipped past the edge of dusk. The early autumn air carried the smell of crushed dry leaves and the slow burn of wood smoke from low chimneys, laced with the thin damp coming off the creek behind a row of houses. Ethan stood still for a few beats, the weight of a worn canvas pack digging into his shoulder, the scuffed edges of his boots grinding against the gravel with a sound like an old greeting. It was just as he remembered, and not at all. The grocery sign had faded, the laundromat's window reflected a paler sky than the one in his memory. He straightened the straps, let out a breath, and felt his chest both wide and hollow. He didn't rush. The walk from the bus stop to the old row of wooden houses was 15 minutes if you pushed it, but tonight everything needed to be slow. Porch lights were already on, their yellow halos falling across the gravel path in blotches like the pattern on a bee's back. Somewhere, a wind chime made from bottle caps clinked lightly, like someone tapping on memory. The wood smoke caught in his throat, carrying him back to winter nights with a hot mug of cocoa, to the shuffle of his father's slippers in the small kitchen. That father was gone now, and no victory medal could give back the quiet nod from the far end of the dinner table. Ethan turned the corner where a late-night diner used to be. The neon now only lit up the letters, "O, Yin," blinking slow and tired. It wasn't that late yet, but the town was already sleeping behind half-closed windows. From somebody's porch came the mix of cheap soap and baked apples, ordinary enough to sting. His eyes swept over the white-painted mailboxes, some peeling, names faded. A few he could still recite from when he was a boy. Others were brand new, strangers moved in with lives he knew nothing about. Each step felt like checking the pulse of an old body. The locksmith shop, the hardware store, the church with its rain-stained rope holding up the Sunday schedule board. The times were written in chalk, a little slanted, with dry dust fallen across the steps. Across the street stood the old garage where Caleb had greased wheel hubs through most of his youth. The bay door had been down for hours, but the smell of oil still hung in the air. Ethan didn't knock, didn't think about calling. Some visits need a morning. Tonight was only for silence. 7 years had been boiled down to a single short word. The kind folks use for long absences, duty. It made the months look clearer on paper, but pushed everything else to the edges. He'd missed dinners, his boy's first baseball season, a 10-minute parent-teacher meeting they said was important. He'd missed watching people age, new lines at his mother's eyes, the slower walk of his father on the porch. When they told him he was coming back late, they meant forever. It arrived like a thin sheet of paper, dark stamp, a few polite lines. No te has. Just silence, and the work that still had to be done. The wind shifted, carrying the damp earth smell from the grass behind the high school field. Far off, the stadium lights swept once in a wide arc, then clicked out. He glanced toward the curb. A child's bike sat abandoned, chain rust-red, seat torn, front wheel a little crooked. The kind of thing people forget until it's time to clear out the shed. He thought of a blue paper kite, of small legs chasing wind, memory slipping past like a sigh. Memory doesn't save you from the present, but sometimes it's the thing that keeps you standing. Passing the barbershop window, he caught his own reflection in the cloudy glass. Broad-shouldered, collar of his coat worn down, hair cut short by habit, a few silver threads he never bothered to hide. There was a faint shadow under his eyes, the mark of long nights without sleep, now that no one was checking the watch list. He lifted his wrist. The old analog watch was scratched. The callus along his index finger, the cracked skin on the second knuckle, small stamps of time, not pretty, not needing a story. A gray cat leapt from a mailbox, darted across the street, and vanished into a pile of leaves. The air was dropping colder, brushing his knees, a feeling that made him stretch his stride just enough to stay warm, but not speed up. Once in a while, a pickup rumbled past, tires crunching the gravel, dust lifting and settling back. No one opened a window to call his name. No one had to. Small towns understood homecomings by not making noise. At the corner stood an old maple, leaves turning like a fire without smoke. Beneath it, a wooden bench damp from rain, the ends carved with someone's initials, a short promise swallowed by moss. Ethan set his hand on the backrest for just a second. Maybe he'd sat here at 17, shirt damp with sweat after running laps, watching the stadium lights cut through the mist. He wondered where the old friends were now. A few names flared up and went dark like shy streetlights. Some had left, some had stayed, some were gone. Those gaps stacked on each other into a feeling hard to name. Part helpless, part at peace, like life was a river flowing the right way whether you stood on one bank or the other. He kept walking. Along the gravel path, trash bags were tied neat in front of each house, orderly in a way only a block's unspoken agreement could make. Inside each bag were small private scraps, a milk carton, an apple core, a folded newspaper. A whole week's worth of life and what you throw away, the thought pulling a tired smile from him. The town's water tower came into view, the word Clearwater painted in white, dulled and scarred with rust in places. Below it, a memorial plaque listed the names of those who had served. Some he knew, some were new. He stopped for a moment, not to salute, just to let the wind pass through. People talk about finding meaning in service, but tonight, the meaning was in standing still and hearing the leaves slide past each other, like an overdue apology. Turning onto the small slope that led to the row of old wooden houses, the smell of rotting wood drifted from a weathered fence. In the yard of one house, a clothesline hung full of white towels, swaying with the wind like unsent letters. In another, an old man knelt at the base of a patch of chrysanthemums, tapping soil loose from their roots, the porch light throwing a thin ring of gold across his back, a clumsy, kind of everyday halo. Nobody looked at him for long. This town practiced kindness in a quiet way, letting you pass without asking questions. The road narrowed. Porch lights grew fewer, the dark thicker, and the sound of his own boots on gravel sharpened. The gate wasn't far now, but the walk stretched out like a long cord, each step a knot tightening around something he hadn't dared to name. He thought of the woman behind that door, of the boy who'd grown taller than he'd imagined. 7 years lay over it all like a heavy curtain, making what was behind it feel both familiar and strange. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of cinnamon, someone steeping tea. His palm found the inside pocket of his coat, touching the small slip of paper with his father's old address. The ink smudged from sweat. He held it between 2 fingers, then tucked it back. There was no ritual that needed to happen tonight, except moving forward. Meaning, if it came, wouldn't fall like rain. It would grow slow, like the grass under a fence, creeping along day by day, until one morning you saw the green had deepened. Ethan passed a half-open window where a fireplace crackled softly. The unimportant noises, water running, wood popping, a wind chime tapping, wove themselves into a rhythm so ordinary it was steadying. He could hear his own heartbeat slowing, as if the clock inside him had finally caught up with the town's. No words rose to explain it, only a single feeling. He'd reached a place where he could stand for a while without being pushed along. At the final bend, a pale gold square of light spilled thinly across the gravel. He knew the little dip in the ground meant he was near the old house. The smell of ripe apples drifted past, probably from somewhere behind the fence. He breathed in, breathed out, folding what was left of all those years away into that simple act. His right hand closed, opened, closed again, a habit for balance when his head grew noisy. He stopped under a flickering street lamp. Dust motes hung in its cone of light, falling in a way that was gently beautiful. Ahead, a darker patch signaled the fence was close. He couldn't yet see the gate, but he knew it was there. A cold iron bar, hinges that would groan. He stayed still another moment, the way you pause before an old photograph, eyes shut, holding the feeling before touching it. Then he stepped forward, the crunch of gravel under his boots carrying him into the thin light spilling from the porch, where a new night in the town was quietly beginning. The glow from the last streetlight behind him faded as Ethan stepped down the short slope into the familiar yard. The ward gate stood quiet, its paint flaking in patches to bare the dull, gray metal beneath. Dry vines clung to the slats, a few last leaves caught in them, brittle and rattling softly in a breeze. His hand found the iron latch, and the chill traveled up his arm like a wire back to another time, when that same hand had gripped the bar from the other side, warmth passing through from his father's palm with a single push. He left his hand there longer than needed. The cool air of early autumn slipped under his collar, the smell of damp wood and wood smoke gathering at the bridge of his nose. Inside the fence, the dark was thicker, only a few shy spots of yellow from the kitchen window, as if the house itself hesitated to open up to someone who'd been gone too long. He stood there, not out of fear, but to take in the whole truth, that he was here, and everyone who'd once stood with him at this threshold had either changed or was gone. The old hinge gave a soft groan when he tested it, but he didn't open it yet. The sound pulled him back to the last morning before he left. His father at the gate, eyes narrowed against the sun, offering only a nod instead of words. His mother deeper in the house, busy at the stove, or pretending to be. No one knew that goodbye would stretch into 7 years, and when a door stays shut that long, the dust settles not only on the hinges but on the memory itself. Ethan let go of the latch and stepped back half a pace, taking in the front of the house in the dark. The roof sat low, the brick chimney fading into the night sky, the dark brown siding now blotched with damp and weather-silvered patches. A window to the left was partly uncurtained, its light spilling in a narrow strip across the porch steps. A shadow crossed behind it, too quick to know who it was. He stood there like a traveler spotting the lantern of a roadside inn, something warm that somehow also weighed heavier on the heart. Somewhere in the branches of the old apple tree, an owl called once low, then fell silent. Ethan closed his eyes, let the sound fade, replaced by the steady thump of his own heart. He pictured Maggie in the kitchen stacking dishes, Sam bent over homework or already asleep. Maybe it was all the same, maybe nothing was. The not knowing made him linger, not from fear of the answer, but from wanting a few more seconds in that space where every possibility was still alive. He drew a deep breath, catching the cinnamon from inside, mixed with the cheap laundry soap clinging to towels on the line. The cinnamon pulled him back to a long-ago evening when his mother set down a small cup of tea and said, "Drink, it'll warm your hands." That hand was gone now, but the memory of its warmth still lived somewhere under the callus and scar. 7 years in the service had taught him to take the edge of desert winds and the damp bite of forest nights. But the cold from his own gate's iron was different. It carried the size of those who had waited, and those who had stopped waiting. He looked down at his boots, road dust clinging to the edges of the soles. The gravel on the path glittered faintly, like a thin strip of stars leading from the gate to the porch. Weeds had pushed up through the cracks between stones. A few spots he'd stepped over 100 times now made him test each one, unsure if the ground was still as firm as it once was. These small things, the crack in the porch step, the house number tilting slightly, told him more than any explanation could. Time here had gone on without him. A stronger gust came through, making the latch tremble and click like a quiet knock. Ethan startled for half a second, then let a small smile cross his face. His hand tightened around the iron bar, the rough cold working its way into his knuckles. He pressed his thumb against a small dent in the latch, a mark from years of opening and closing, maybe partly from his own hands when he was a boy. It was a strange feeling, familiar like touching a part of himself, yet foreign, like shaking hands with someone who'd changed. Far off, the heavy groan of an old truck drifted down the main road, then faded, leaving only the rustle of dry leaves. In that quiet, everything outside the fence seemed to blur until it was just him and the gate. Standing there felt like being caught between two lives, one wrapped in sand and road dust, the other in the wooden frame of a house he'd once thought was solid, but maybe wasn't anymore. He thought of his father, and the last time they'd spoken on this porch. No long instructions, just a look, a nod, and a hand on his shoulder. Back then, he believed the important things would wait for him to return. Now he knew they didn't. That kind of loss didn't roar. It settled in your muscles and your breathing. It was the reason he still stood there, not knocking, not opening. A thin strip of light moved across the curtain, quick and faint like an unmeant signal. Ethan let out a breath, white in the cold air. He slid his hand off the latch, letting it hang in the air for a second, as if weighing his choice again. Wind slipped through the fence slats, carrying a sound so soft it was hard to place. Maybe dishes clinking, maybe a wooden chair shifting on the floor. Small as it was, it pulled him back into the present. He lifted his hand and knocked, light but steady. The sound carried into the night, not rushed, just enough to let whoever was inside know someone was waiting. He slid his hand into his pocket, lowered his eyes to his boots, and waited, not for the door to open, but for himself to be ready to step through. This threshold wasn't just into a house, but into everything that had changed while he'd been gone. The door opened with a thin, familiar creak, the same sound it made when he was a boy coming home after baseball practice. Light spilled out, cutting a narrow strip into the darkness of the porch. Maggie stood there, her hand still on the edge of the door, as if she didn't quite want it open all the way. Her smile barely touched her lips before fading, quick as a light flicker in a power outage. In her eyes was something held back, not letting him in, but not pushing him away either, a hazy border he recognized without a word. Behind her, Sam appeared. He was nearly his father's height now, shoulders narrow but straight, hair cropped neat. His face was half in light, half in shadow under the ceiling bulb, making his features harder to read. Something of his father in the eyes, but the gaze passed right through him, looking for a point farther off. Sam didn't step forward, didn't back away. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, his stance balanced somewhere between caution and indifference. That moment didn't come with cheers or the kind of tight embrace people imagine when they picture a homecoming. Just a couple of nods, a few sidesteps to make room. Ethan crossed the threshold, the house greeting him with a mix of old wood, cheap soap, and a faint warmth from the kitchen. It wasn't the smell of a family gathered, but of a place that had kept on existing without him. Maggie closed the door slowly, as if drawing out the space between them just a little longer. She turned toward the kitchen, her canvas shoes tapping softly on the wood floor, a background rhythm nobody paid much attention to. Sam stayed where he was, eyes on his father, until Ethan met that gaze. Then he looked down at the floor, as if he'd only been glancing that way by accident. The living room was almost unchanged. The old armchair still sitting off at an angle, the scratched coffee table, the low bookshelf with a few titles leaning. But the family photo that used to hang by the porch was gone, the one Ethan always looked at first when he came home on leave. The bare space left behind showed a darker patch of paint, like a piece of memory pulled away and never replaced. He set his pack down by the chair. It landed with a muted thump that made the tabletop tremble. Sam stepped past, careful not to brush against it, the way you'd skirt around something unfamiliar. Ethan's eyes dropped to his son's sneakers, worn, the sole beginning to peel away at the edge. Little details like that said more than any greeting could, about the time he'd missed and the things the boy had handled on his own. From the kitchen came the sound of pots clinking, a simple, everyday noise, but tonight it felt like it came from a long way off. Standing there, Ethan felt like he'd walked into a living museum of his own life. Every object the same, but stripped of its old meaning. He didn't know where to begin, so he stayed still, his eyes catching on the doorway to the back porch, where the yard had already disappeared into the dark. Sam passed by on his way to his room. No words, just another small nod like a formality. The bedroom door clicked shut, the soft sound of a lock following. Not loud, but enough to remind Ethan the line was still there. Maggie reappeared with 2 bowls in her hands. She set one on the table and, with a glance, motioned for him to sit before heading back for spoons. No questions about the trip, no talk about the years apart. No blame either. Everything moved as if he'd only been gone a few days, not nearly a decade. It was the kind of silence you couldn't tell whether to be grateful for or sorry about. He sat, running his hand lightly over the worn tabletop. Beneath his fingers, the small cracks felt like dry earth. He remembered polishing this very surface for his mother before Christmas dinner one year. Now each line felt like a marker for the meals he'd missed, the stories he hadn't heard, the looks he hadn't seen. Outside, the wind slipped through the doorframe, bringing with it the damp scent of the back garden. Ethan looked up and caught Maggie's eyes for a brief second as she set the bowl in front of him. It wasn't a long look, but it told him something. She'd learned how to live without him, and now she was working to keep that balance, even with him back. It wasn't anger, just a new order that his presence might unsettle. He took the spoon and lifted a mouthful of soup. The taste was simple, not far from his memory, but it felt different. Familiar and distant at the same time, as if each bite reminded him of the times he hadn't been at this table. Maggie sat opposite, her eyes flicking now and then to the wall clock, not to rush him, but like she was waiting for something else to come. Maybe the end of the meal, maybe the moment he'd stand and head to bed. The room was so quiet he could hear the soft clink of spoons on bowls, the faint creak of wood under a shifting chair. Somewhere else, this kind of quiet might be peace. Here tonight, it felt like a pane of glass between him and the rest of the house. He could see through it, hear through it, but not touch. And he knew, if he had any chance, he'd have to learn to step through it little by little. Dinner sat on the table the way meals had for years. A steaming pot of chicken soup laced with cinnamon and pepper, a few slices of toast on an old chip plate, a jar of peanut butter with a spoon left leaning inside. The overhead light cast a warm circle just big enough to cover the table, the rest of the room falling into shadow. Ethan sat at the head, the spoon turning slowly in his hand, making the soup ripple. The steam rose against his face, but he didn't taste it right away. Maggie, across from him, divided her portion with slow, even motions, as if it helped keep her heartbeat steady. Sam sat next to her, back slightly bent, one hand on his lap, the other holding a spoon he hardly moved. Ethan broke the silence with a simple story, his voice low and steady, about a buddy who carried a small radio through 9 months of deployment, playing the same old song every night. He kept it light, focusing on the small details, the smell of sweat and machine oil, the static mixing with the night wind. He left out the rest, the explosions, the long patrols when no one knew if they'd make it back whole. Maggie gave a faint smile, her eyes flicking his way before dropping back to her bowl. Sam hardly reacted, just tore a piece of bread, dipped it into his soup, then set it back down. His movements felt distracted, like a machine running an idle. Every time Ethan looked up, Sam's eyes had already shifted away, finding a spot on the wall or the table instead. Ethan tried another story, about the night the whole unit had to patch up a tent roof in the middle of storm, ending with everyone sitting around a sputtering oil stove, drenched but laughing when the coffee pot tipped over. His voice stayed calm, just enough to let the words flow like warm water. But he knew these stories were just small stones tossed onto a still pond, sending ripples that faded too quickly. Sam nudged the slice of bread farther from his plate, glanced at his father for a split second, then dropped his eyes again. He tapped his spoon once against the rim of his bowl, like he was trying to keep himself awake, then went quiet. From the corner of his eye, Ethan watched, searching for some way to open the door between them, but every path seemed shut. Maggie set another bowl of soup in front of him, her movement natural, without asking if he wanted more. He gave a small nod instead of saying thank you, took a spoonful, and tasted it. The flavor pulled him back to early cold season evenings when his father was still alive, the whole family eating together while the local news murmured from the radio. But here, now, there was only the sound of spoons on china and bread breaking into crumbs. He tried turning to Sam, asking a few questions about school, about basketball. The boy answered in short phrases, voice low, never lifting his head. The last answer was just a shrug, followed by a silence longer than the tick of the wall clock. Ethan didn't blame him, didn't push. He only looked down into his bowl, thinking of how many times he'd pictured this moment from across the ocean, imagining laughter, a hand on his shoulder. But imagining was easy, reality was colder. The meal moved like a slow-motion reel, the lifting and setting down of spoons, faint breaths, the lamp casting the shadows of 3 people onto the wall, stretching and fading when a chair shifted. By the time the bread had gone cold and the soup was only lukewarm, Maggie stood and carried her bowl to the kitchen. Sam set down his spoon and, in a voice so low Ethan wasn't sure if it was words or just the scrape of a chair, asked to go upstairs. When Sam's door clicked shut, Ethan stayed where he was, staring at the empty space left behind. From the kitchen came the steady sound of running water, a kind of background layer to cover the quiet. He drew a slow breath, catching the lingering scent of soup at the table, and understood that what he thought he'd be bringing home, warmth, laughter, wasn't in the same place anymore. It had shifted or disappeared, and he'd have to learn how to find it again if he still wanted to. The house had settled into stillness. Maggie's footsteps in the kitchen had been gone for a while, and out in the back, only the wind moved through the leaves. In the living room, the old pendulum clock kept time at a slow, steady pace, like the breath of something ancient. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Ethan lay on his old wooden bed. The mattress sagged in the middle, shaped by another body from the years he'd been gone. On the ceiling, a crack ran from the corner toward the center, just as he remembered when he left, except now it was darker, deeper, as if time had worn away some of the wood's patience. The smell of damp would hung in the air, mixing with the cold that slipped through the window frame. There was a trace of rotting leaves from the backyard, and the earthy chill left after yesterday's rain. Each breath felt like lying in a field tent, the ground breathing beneath him, waiting for a morning whose terms he didn't yet know. His eyes landed on the low bookshelf in the corner. The books he'd left behind were still there, their covers worn and curling, some turned the wrong way, mixed with odds and ends that weren't his, a small picture frame, a seashell, a few folded slips of paper. It all looked like a museum room made from his life. Things added without erasing what was there before, creating a different version of the man he used to be. Outside the window, the night breeze stirred the thin curtain, the soft rustle blending with the slow tick of the clock. Then inside that rhythm, Ethan caught another sound, barely there but sharp enough to cut through his thoughts. Clink, clink. At first, he thought it might be a dry branch brushing the window frame. But it came again, steady, weighted like metal meeting earth. He leaned forward, listening. Still the same. Clink, clink, followed by a pause, then repeating. It was coming from the backyard. He swung his legs off the bed, feet landing on the cold floorboards. The wood creaked under his weight, and the sound pulled at an old muscle memory. Those nights on watch when even the faintest noise could lock your whole body in place. This was like that, not because of any clear danger, but because the rhythm had intent. Ethan stepped quietly to the window, shifted to one side, and eased the curtain open just enough to see through. Moonlight, thin but steady, fell across the yard, outlining the basics. The fence, the old apple tree, and a figure bent low. The shape moved in a measured way, hands lifting and dropping. Clink, clink, the sound of a small shovel breaking soil. He narrowed his eyes, heartbeat slow but heavy. The shape was familiar. Short hair, narrow shoulders. Sam. No flashlight, no hat or gloves. Just a thin jacket and a small spade in his hands. Ethan didn't call out, didn't open the door. He just stood there, watching through the slit in the curtain. Sam was digging a hole, not very deep, about to his knees, moving with the care of someone who'd done it before. Then the boy reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular wooden box. Moonlight caught on its surface, showing a few old scratches. Sam set the box at the bottom of the hole and stayed there for a moment, head slightly bowed, lips moving in silence. Then he began covering it, one layer at a time, slow and even, keeping the soil from spilling over the edges. Something in Ethan's chest tightened. Not quite fear, not quite anger. More like the feeling of seeing something that didn't belong to you. Clink, clink, the shovel pressed the dirt flat, then stopped. Sam stood, brushed his hands on his pants, looked around once, and stepped back into the dark shadow of the apple tree before disappearing through the kitchen door. Upstairs, Ethan stayed frozen at the window. The moon pulled back from the yard, leaving the fresh-turned patch darker than the rest. The clock downstairs kept its slow count. He let the curtain fall, turned to the bed, but didn't lie down. The picture of Sam in that moonlight, bent over the hole, the wooden box, looped in his mind like film stuck on a single frame. He sat with his back against the wall, hands resting on his knees, eyes on the dark shape of the room. No explanation came, only the steady tick-tock and the feeling that he'd stumbled into a part of his son's life he'd never been invited to enter. The moon that night was so thin it looked like one breath could scatter it, yet strong enough to lay a pale wash over the backyard. The curtain shifted in Ethan's fingers, framing the yard like a black-and-white photo slowly appearing in a tray of developer. Sam stood under the old apple tree, its gnarled trunk twisted like an ancient hand reaching into the sky. Under the sparse leaves, his shadow shifted, sometimes blending into the trunk's darkness, sometimes stepping into the moon's narrow light. In his hands, a worn metal spade. Every time the blade cut into the soil, a dull, muffled sound followed, then silence, then another cut, steady, unhurried. No flashlight, no gloves, just a gray jacket hanging a bit loose on his shoulders and canvas shoes stained with dirt. Ethan noticed the precision in every movement. Sam didn't hack at the ground like a kid rushing through a chore. He pressed with just enough force, turned his wrist smoothly, lifted each clump and set it aside in a neat pile. There was something in that steadiness that raised the hairs at the back of Ethan's neck. Not fear, but the realization this wasn't the first time. Sam moved like someone repeating a ritual, the motion so ingrained they needed no thought. The earth under the apple tree was damp tonight, smelling faintly of rot and leaf mold. Each time the spade bit in, the soil broke into small chunks, and the moon caught on the damp grains, making them glisten like a dusting of salt. His breath rose in thin clouds, fading the moment they met the faint wind slipping through the fence slats. Ethan shifted to keep the moonlight off his face, fingers tight on the curtain edge. He didn't know how long he stood there, only that each stroke of Sam's spade made time slow down. The yard was so quiet that, without that sound, it might have felt frozen. Then Sam stopped. The hole was knee-deep now. He set the spade aside, reached into his jacket, and brought out something small. The moon slid over its surface, old wood, rectangular, dark, the corners worn smooth. Ethan squinted, but distance and light gave him only scratches and fine cracks like a spider's web. Sam knelt, lowering the box gently into the bottom of the hole as if it could be hurt. He stayed like that for a few seconds, head bowed, shoulders loose. His lips moved, but no sound carried. If they were words, only the tree and the soil heard them. Then he began covering it. No hurried scoops, just laying each handful in place, smoothing it flat with the spade. Every so often he paused to press the dirt down with the back of his hand, sealing it tight. When the patch matched the color of the ground around it, he scattered a few dry leaves on top, hiding the mark. Ethan realized his own breathing had gone shallow without him noticing. He couldn't take his eyes off the scene, not just out of curiosity, but because it felt like he was watching something so private he had no right to step into it. Sam stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, picked up the shovel, and looked around. His gaze slid past the dark space beneath Ethan's window, seeming not to notice anything there. He headed back inside through the kitchen door. When his shadow was gone, the yard felt suddenly bare again, the old apple tree standing as the lone, silent witness. The fresh patch of soil was darker than the rest of the ground, almost round, sitting inside the dappled light of the moon coming through the branches. Ethan let the curtain fall, but the image stayed behind his eyelids. He felt the cold in his hands, the cold of someone standing too long outside a story they wanted to enter. Downstairs, the clock kept counting, steady as a patient gatekeeper, while he still had no reason strong enough to open the door between himself and his son. The next morning, with dew still clinging to the grass and the chill sinking into his palms, Ethan was already by the apple tree. Pale daylight spread over the yard, touching the patch of dark, freshly turned earth like a scar that hadn't yet faded. He stood there with both hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on it. The kitchen door cracked open. Sam stepped out, hair messy from sleep, a sweater thrown on, worn sneakers at his feet. He stopped short when he saw his father waiting, his gaze flicking quickly from Ethan's face to the patch of earth. No words were needed, he understood. "You want to tell me? But do I dig it up?" Ethan's voice was low, not sharp, but carrying a weight that hung between them. Sam swallowed, his eyes shifting, then walked closer. Without a word, he reached for the shovel leaning on the fence and began to dig. The first bite of the blade into the soil landed heavier than it had the night before. The ground was still damp, clinging to the metal, forcing him to use his shoulders. Ethan stayed still, watching every movement, his eyes never leaving his son's hands. Each time the blade turned, the dirt broke apart, revealing fine old roots from the apple tree like strands of aging muscle. Sam said nothing. His breath came in pale clouds that vanished into the cold air. The digging was slow, deliberate, each layer lifted and set neatly aside. After a few minutes, the edge of a wooden surface emerged. Ethan could see the dark wood, wet through, the grain deepened like streaks of old rain. Sam knelt, brushing away the dirt with his hands. A box took shape, its corners worn, the surface crisscrossed with scratches. A small lock at the front was rusted over, as if it had been sitting in silence for years. Setting the shovel down, he lifted the box with both hands. Ethan watched closely as his son set it gently on the ground, as if whatever was inside could break or be hurt. Sam sat for a moment with his hands still on the lid, thumb tracing the groove of the lock. The air between them felt as heavy as freshly dug soil. A sparrow called from somewhere along the fence, then went quiet when the wind moved through. Ethan leaned down, placing his hand on the lid, feeling the cold of rusted metal and the dampness soaked into the wood. He didn't open it right away. Sam's eyes stayed on the box, like he was holding onto the last bit of distance before the truth could spill out. "Where'd you get it?" Ethan asked, voice even, but no answer came. Sam only let out a breath, pulled his hand back, and stayed still, letting the silence stretch. Dew on the grass began to fade in the weak sun, but the patch of earth they dug was still dark and damp. Ethan knew this moment couldn't be forced. He gestured toward the house. Sam gave a small nod, picked up the box, and crossed the yard, mud clinging to his shoe soles. They left the old apple tree behind, its roots perhaps having witnessed more secrets than anyone inside those walls. In the kitchen, light spilled through the small window, pooling on the worn wooden table. Sam set the box down, sat, and stared at it like he was trying to figure out where to start. Ethan pulled a chair across from him. Neither spoke. Only the soft hiss and click of the kettle heating on the stove filled the space. The rusted lock gave a dry snap when Ethan tried to turn it. It wouldn't open. He stood, rummaged in a drawer, and came back with a small knife, working the tip under the latch. The metal gave quickly, bending and breaking after a few pries. The lid lifted slightly, and a breath of damp air drifted out, carrying the musty scent of old paper mixed with years of wood. Before Ethan could look inside, Sam's hand pressed against the edge, holding it closed. He drew in a deep breath, then let his hand drop away. When the lid came fully open, the contents lay there quietly, as if they'd been waiting all the years Ethan was gone. And in that morning light, Ethan saw it wasn't just a wooden box. It was a call from the past, something that would force both of them to face what they thought was buried for good under last night's cold earth. Inside, yellowed papers lay stacked, edges frayed, some curled from dampness. The smell of aged paper mixed with the deep, earthy scent of long-kept wood, catching in Ethan's throat. Among them, a handful of black and white photographs, corners flaking silver, the surface speckled as if dust had worked itself into the fibers. One picture showed a group of men standing in front of a red brick building with a steep roof, the faded words beneath reading, Clearwater Town, Hall 1987. In the center stood a thin man with sharp eyes and neatly combed hair. Ethan's father, Ward. Around him were other faces, some familiar from scraps of childhood memory, others strangers altogether. Ethan turned the photo over and saw 3 words scrawled in blue ink, the day we got the seal. Simple as they were, they made him pause. He set the photo aside, his fingers brushing against an envelope tucked between the stack of papers. It wasn't thick, the paper a little stiff, one corner yellowed, as if it had been through decades of rain and sun. Across the front, in a hand he knew instantly, tilted slightly right, shaky but unmistakable, were the words, "For E.W., when the time comes," and beneath them, Ward's signature. The E.W. pressed down on his chest. Not Ethan, not son, but the shorthand his father had used only when it was just the two of them, a kind of private code that belonged to no one else. He held the envelope, the roughness of the paper carrying a trace of warmth that had long since gone. His thumb followed the quick, uneven lines of the signature, ink faded but still holding the urgency of its strokes. When the time comes, Ethan felt the space between him and his father widening, not because death had taken him, but because of what the man had kept back and never said. Sam sat across from him, watching each movement without asking, without urging. His eyes stayed on the envelope like it was something both foreign and familiar, a thing he'd touched by accident when he opened the box the night before, but hadn't dared to go further with. Ethan set the envelope down, drew in a slow breath, and lifted the stack of papers beneath it. There were typed municipal reports, stamped with round seals now blurred, blue ink dating them to 1987, a few scraps of handwriting, hurried as if copied mid-conversation, and a map of Clearwater, red lines layered over one another, some points circled. Among the papers was another photograph, a long wooden table, and on it a large metal seal with a dark wooden handle. Only a man's hand was in frame, his face out of view. But Ethan knew that seal. He'd seen it in his father's study before it disappeared. He looked back to the envelope, then to Sam. Morning light angled through the small window, catching the paper's edge, lighting up each fiber. Ethan's fingers hovered over it, caught between wanting to open it now and fearing what was inside. Maybe the time his father wrote about had come. Or maybe Ethan just needed to believe it had, because some part of him was tired of unanswered spaces. Outside, the early wind whispered through the apple branches, a few leaves dropping onto the patch of dirt they'd dug up yesterday. Inside, the kitchen kept the warmth of boiling water and the smell of old wood, but between father and son was a silence thick enough to tear with one small move. Ethan still hadn't opened the envelope. He rested it on his thigh, hands laced, eyes drifting beyond the doorway, as if waiting for his father to step in and say it wasn't time yet. But the chair across from him stayed empty, and Sam stayed still. Time seemed to hold, giving Ethan the uneasy sense that he was standing on the threshold of a door, one that, once stepped through, would change everything and never let him back. He turned the envelope slowly in his fingers, as if searching for a reason to keep it sealed just a little longer. Then a long, steady breath pulled him back. He slid his finger under the softened flap, tugged gently. The tear came with a dry, brittle sound that made Sam flinch just slightly. Inside was a sheet of paper folded in thirds, pale yellow gone brown along the creases. Ethan opened it carefully, afraid one wrong move might split it in two. The scent of old paper rose up, bringing with it the feel of the record rooms he'd wandered through as a boy. the place where his father worked, where the sound of a typewriter blended with the steady tick of a wall clock. Ward's handwriting slanted slightly, steady at first, but trembling toward the end, as if it had been written in the long hours of a night when the desk lamp grew tired and the hand behind the pen began to lose its strength. EW, the first line read, "If you're reading this, I'm no longer here, and you've likely come back from farther than I ever traveled." Ethan swallowed slowly, his eyes moving down the page. His father described the events of 1987, when Clearwater was shaken by rumors of lost public land. Dozens of acres on the western edge suddenly transferred into private hands, official maps altered, and most critically, the town's property seal disappearing from the clerk's office. "They said I took it," the letter went on, "but the truth is I was just the easiest name to sacrifice. I refused to sign the new map, refused to legalize the transfer. They needed one loud opponent to turn into a criminal, to scare the rest into silence." Ethan's fingers tightened on the paper. In his memory, Ward had always been a man of few words, but his eyes lit with a clear, steady fire whenever he spoke about protecting the town's public boundaries, as if it were not just duty, but a promise to those who'd built Clearwater from start. Donnelly, the letter continued, was only the deputy head of planning then, but he already knew how to use power like a trap. He understood that if he got the original map, he'd hold the whole town in his hands, and he did everything he could to get it. Ethan stopped there. The name carried a bitterness in his throat. As a boy, Sheriff Donnelly used to stop by, talking to his father in a voice that was half friendly, half command. Growing older, Ethan realized that friendliness had been nothing more than a thin coat of paint. In the letter, Ward mentioned an original map, the unaltered property map, with every landmark and legal signature intact. "I hid it," he wrote, "not for myself but for the town. If it falls into Donnelly's hands, all proof will vanish. It's not where they'd think to look, and no one, but you will know it when you see it." Ethan read that last line over and over, looking for the weight behind the words. Not where they'd think, no one but you. Was it a message, a riddle, or a burden? He looked up and found Sam's eyes fixed on him, silent since Ethan had torn open the envelope, watching without blinking, as if waiting to see what his father would do with this piece of the past now laid bare. Outside, the morning wind picked up, rattling the apple branches and casting broken shadows across the kitchen door. Ethan lowered the letter, setting it beside the photographs and papers. Those handwritten lines didn't just tell the story of a false charge. They pulled him into an unfinished current, a promise his father had left behind, written not in voice, but in ink and paper. He folded the letter gently, holding it a moment longer. That familiar sense of helplessness stirred. Helplessness in the face of what was gone, of time that couldn't be pulled back, and of the truth that the biggest questions in life often only get answered when it's too late. But threaded through was something else, faint but distinct. Purpose. Maybe this was what would carry him and his son forward, even if it led them into the darker corners of a town he thought he'd left behind. Sam still sat across the table, hands laced, eyes fixed on some invisible point in the wood grain. His breathing was steady, but a touch too quick, like someone bracing to step into ground they knew they couldn't return from. Ethan set the letter beside the yellowed papers, his hand resting on the box, feeling each scratch, each worn edge shaped by time. "Where'd you find it?" Ethan asked, his voice low, not pushing, but leaving no room for the question to be ignored. Sam lifted his head slowly. For an instant, his eyes flickered with the look of someone caught holding a secret they weren't ready to share. "In the attic," he said quietly, "in the old blue trunk, under the wool blankets and some dusty notebooks. I thought it was Grandpa's." He paused, taking in a breath and letting it out, as if clearing the way for the rest. "I buried it so Mom wouldn't see." Ethan stayed silent. In his mind, the attic rose up clearly, the low wood beams, the damp smell settling into the skin, the stacks of cardboard boxes marked in different hands over the years. He knew the trunk Sam meant. It had belonged to Ward, always kept locked, though the latch had rusted and given way long ago. And he knew why Sam had hidden it. Maggie, with her sharp eyes and instinct for order, wouldn't let something so full of old documents and tangled history sit unopened in the house. Ethan closed the box with a soft, decisive click. It wasn't to refuse the story, but to hold it intact a moment longer, like shutting a door on a memory you weren't ready to walk all the way into. Sam watched, but didn't protest. He only leaned back slowly in his chair, his eyes drifting from the box to the letter beside it. "I didn't know what was inside," he murmured. Just saw the envelope and a few things that looked important. I didn't want Mom to read them first. A cool draft slipped in through the window, stirring the thin curtain. The morning light shifted, laying a soft gold over the wooden box, making it seem like it belonged to another time. Ethan rested his hand on it once more, this time to feel the connection between the grandfather Sam had never truly known and the son Ethan was still learning how to understand again. In him, the sense of helplessness was still there. Helpless because of the years already gone, because his father wasn't here to answer, because of Maggie and the distance that couldn't be bridged with a few words. But alongside it, something else was quietly taking root, something that made him realize he wasn't living just for himself anymore. Ethan pushed his chair back, stood, and moved the wooden box out of the direct line of the window's light. He set it on the high shelf above the kitchen table, far enough that no one would touch it by accident, but still in plain sight whenever he walked into the room. Sam followed his every step, silent, though Ethan caught the flicker of relief in his eyes. Neither of them spoke. The wall clock kept its even tick, broken only by the sound of apple leaves falling outside onto the yard. Ethan stood there a moment longer, looking out the window. Whatever was in that box could be a clue, a threat, or just the remnant of an old story time hadn't finished erasing. But now, it wasn't the burden of a man who was gone. It had become part of his and his son's responsibility. He turned to Sam. The boy was looking back at him, no longer avoiding his gaze like the night before. And though no promise was spoken aloud, Ethan knew they had stepped together onto a new path, one where every step would press into the old soil of the past in search of something buried for far too long. The afternoon fell slowly, as if the sun itself was picking its way through the gray clouds. Ethan pulled on his old ball cap and headed down the road toward the south end of town. The maples along both sides were thinning out, the wind carrying with it the smell of gasoline and rust from the far end of the street, where Caleb Ross still kept his repair shop, just as he had for the last 30 years. The shop sat on the corner where two narrow streets met, its tin roof sun-bleached and dull. Out front, a scatter of stripped-down frames and wheel-less shells lined the curb. The familiar pulse of the air compressor and the ring of a hammer on steel drifted out to the sidewalk, blending with the thick smell of grease. The bay door was rolled halfway up, just enough to see Caleb bent over the open hood of a faded green pickup. Ethan stopped at the edge of the door, not stepping in right away. He watched his friend for a long moment, noting the same wide-shouldered frame, now with hair gone more than half gray. Caleb looked up, swiped sweat off his forehead with his sleeve, and met Ethan's eyes. There was no shout, no clasped embrace, just a small nod, the kind two soldiers once gave each other from the same trench, needing no words. "You're back," Caleb said, his voice roughened by dust and tobacco, then motioned toward the old wooden chair near the door. Ethan sat, watching Caleb's hands move quick and certain over the bolts, the slow, steady churn of the engine like a heartbeat in the background. When the truck rumbled back to life, Caleb cut the ignition, reached for a cigarette from a tin on the shelf, and lit it. The smoke curled into the air, mixing with the smell of oil in a way Ethan had carried with him through all the years away. They didn't talk about the weather or their health. Ethan set the wooden box on the small work table, opened the lid, and drew out Ward's letter. Caleb read it slowly, his eyes growing heavier with each line. When he finished, he folded the paper, handed it back, and leaned against the wall, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "Donnelly," Caleb said, tasting the name like it was something sour. Back then, he wasn't sheriff yet, just a deputy, but his shadow already covered the whole damn town. Ethan stayed quiet, letting Caleb set his own pace. "I remember," Caleb went on, "he came with a couple guys from the town office to see your old man. Tried to force him to sign some papers, fake ones, no doubt. Your dad refused. Couple weeks later, the seal and the map went missing. And, well, you know the rest." Caleb stopped, ground out his cigarette in a coffee can ashtray. "If you really want the truth, not just the rumors, you need to find Evelyn Price. She lives at the end of Church Street, near the church. Used to work in the town archives. She's seen more than she ever said." The name stirred a faint memory. Ethan pictured a thin woman with silver hair pulled high, always wearing white gloves when she handled files. As a boy, he'd seen her at a desk in the archive room, a yellow desk lamp casting her face in a shadow between rows of stacked shelves. Caleb stood, wiped his hands on a rag, lowered his voice. "But don't expect her to be happy you showed up. Evelyn learned to stay safe by staying quiet. In Clearwater, silence is armor. Take it off, and you don't last long." Ethan nodded, picked up the wooden box, feeling its weight grow heavier. He knew the next step wouldn't just be about finding answers. It would mean stepping into a part of the past people had worked hard to bury, and not everyone would want to see it unearthed. Outside, the wind carried the smell of gas and the faint toll of the church bell, drawn out and low, mixing with the steady beat of a decision settling deep inside him. Church Street in the late afternoon was longer and quieter than any road in town. Old oak trees lined both sides, their patchy shadows falling over worn stone pavement. The last of the season's leaves spun slowly in the breeze before settling on the silvered rooftops. Ethan walked slowly, cradling the wooden box like something alive, with its own breath, its own memory. Evelyn Price's house sat at the very end, set a little apart from the small church. A narrow wooden home, once white, now faded to cream. Moss clung to the steep roof and the edges of the stone steps. The front window was cracked open, lace curtains shifting lightly as if breathing. No music, no TV, just a stillness so pure you could hear the wind brushing the fence. Ethan knocked. After a moment, slow footsteps came from inside. Evelyn appeared, small in her beige cardigan, silver hair tied up neatly. She looked at him for a long time, her pale gray eyes seeming to sift through decades of dust. No polite greeting, just a small nod before she opened the door wide enough to let him in. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of old paper and linseed oil. Wooden shelves lined the walls, crowded with rolled maps and file boxes. The last of the afternoon light streamed through a west window, laying a stripe of gold across the long table in the center. Evelyn didn't ask why he'd come. She didn't wait for him to explain. She went straight to a tall cabinet in the corner, unlocked it with a long brass key, and swung the door open with a creak that spoke of years without oil. She searched the lower drawers with slow, exact movements, like she'd known all along what she was after. Finally, she pulled out a bundle of old maps, paper yellowed, edges curled, and a stack of documents with names and signatures clumsily erased. She set them on the table, sliding them toward Ethan. "These," she said, her voice rough with the dust of paper, "are the property records from the West End. 1987. The blank spots, those are where the old owners' names and signatures were." Ethan turned the pages, eyes catching on the unnatural white patches, the faint shadows of ink scraped away. Midway through, a black and white photo slipped out and landed face down. He picked it up and turned it over. In the picture, Donnelly, young then, in a white shirt and pale vest, stood on an open stretch of field, sparse grass underfoot. In the distance, new power lines cut the sky. Ethan knew the place now. It was where a row of expensive homes stood on the edge of town. But it wasn't Donnelly's self-assured expression that froze him. It was what the man held, a large brass seal, its wooden handle darkened with age. Ethan reached into his box, lifted out the seal, and set it beside the photo. The fading gold of the late afternoon washed over them both, the match so perfect it seemed to pull the warmth out of the room. Same wooden grip, same brass ring, same carved emblem. Evelyn didn't look up at him. "I've kept that photo for years," she said quietly. "Nobody asked, so I didn't show it. But if you've come this far—" She stopped, her fingers resting on the edge of the map. "Then maybe it's time." Outside the window, the light pulled away from the table, leaving the softer gray of evening to settle over the papers. Ethan folded the map, feeling its weight differently now. Not just paper and ink, but a piece of truth Clearwater had buried, now returned to his hands. Evelyn shut the cabinet, turned the key, and disappeared into the kitchen where the kettle had begun to tap and hiss. The faint scent of jasmine tea drifted in, curling together with the must of old paper. For a moment, it could have been any ordinary evening in the life of an elderly woman living alone. But on the table, the seal and the photo lay side by side, like two puzzle pieces waiting for someone to fit them into the picture no one had dared hang for 30 years. When she returned, her steps were soft, as if careful not to disturb the long-settled dust. She set a cream-colored mug in front of Ethan, a small chip missing from its rim. Wisps of steam from the jasmine tea twisted upward, fading into the dimming air. The last light from the west window barely reached the table now, leaving just a pale circle of gold on the wood. She sat across from him, both hands cupping her own mug, her thin fingers marked with raised blue veins. For a long while, neither spoke. The ticking of the wall clock filled the room, mixing with the dry shuffle of leaves outside. Ethan's eyes stayed on the seal. The tarnished brass seemed to drink in the little light left, its carved face shadowed. At last, Evelyn spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone who'd seen more than they cared to remember. "If you stir this up, no one will stand with you," she said, her gaze locked on his. Every word sounded measured, heavy enough to land exactly where she meant it. Ethan sipped his tea. The warmth went down his throat, but a chill slid up his spine. She wasn't exaggerating. In this town, people chose safety over justice, silence over loss. And when someone broke that balance, they became an outsider. Evelyn set her cup down, the faint click of porcelain like a period to her warning. But her eyes didn't match the words. Deep in the pale gray, Ethan saw something else. A quiet push, steady and certain, like she was saying do it without letting the sound pass her lips. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping lower. "Some things, if left to rot in the dark, will never rest. They'll creep into your sleep, into every breath, until someone's got the guts to drag them out." Ethan didn't answer right away. He placed a hand on the wooden box, feeling the grain under his palm like a map to somewhere he'd never been but couldn't turn away from now. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the damp scent of earth and rotting wood, the smell of abandoned places he remembered from the days he'd cleaned out his father's house after the accusations. For a moment, he wondered if Evelyn had kept her own version of this story, a version she'd packed away in the deepest drawer, along with the map and the photograph. And now, with him standing here holding the box, maybe she was passing that weight on, gently but firmly, like handing off a torch in the dark. She leaned back, eyes never leaving his, silent as if waiting for a decision. The shadows had claimed nearly all of the room, leaving only the small lamp in the corner to outline the deep lines around her eyes. And in that moment, Ethan understood. Her warning wasn't meant to stop him. It was meant to see if he was ready to pay the price for moving forward. He gave a small nod, not yes, not no, but a thank you for letting him see more of the picture he was about to walk into. In the quiet, the tea still sent its faint warmth into the air, and the seal sat motionless between them. But both of them knew, from this moment on, neither could pretend it hadn't been placed there. The wooden door of Evelyn's house closed behind him with a tired creak, then silence, leaving Ethan alone on the porch. The sky had gone fully dark now. None of the flickering gold of sunset, just the dense weight of night pressing down over the roofs and the trees. Wind moved along Church Street, sweeping dry leaves across the stone-paved road, carrying the damp, earthy smell of moss and cold soil. He pulled his collar up, feeling the chill settle heavier on his shoulders than when he'd first arrived. In his hands, the wooden box seemed colder too, though it still carried that familiar weight, the same weight that had followed him from the backyard of the ward house all the way to Evelyn's paper-filled room. He stepped through the gate, his boots sounding in slow, spaced-out thumps like the distant beat of a drum. His pickup was parked under an old maple, its red leaves nearly all gone. Bare branches tapped the roof whenever the wind shifted. Inside, Sam sat in the passenger's seat, his thin frame swallowed up in a baggy gray hoodie. The cab light wasn't on. Only the faraway glow of a street lamp filtered in through the glass, enough to catch the half of his face turned toward the window, staring out into the dark. Ethan opened the door. The squeal of the hinge cut through the quiet. Sam turned his head, but asked nothing. He just set a hand, long fingers still holding a trace of boyish roundness, on the back of his father's seat. No demand, no question, just a quiet way of saying, "I'm here." Ethan slid behind the wheel, shut the door, and the wind stayed outside. He turned the key. The old engine rumbled to life, but a layer of silence still hung between them. Sam pulled his hand back, yet his eyes stayed on his father. Not probing, not sharp, just steady, like he needed to keep him in sight. They left Church Street, tires crunching over loose gravel until the sound faded under the smoother hum of asphalt. Thick trees lined the road on both sides, breaking only for the occasional weak glow from a far-off window. Every mile felt longer than it should, not because of distance, but because he was bringing home more than what he'd gone for. An old map, a photograph, and Evelyn's warning threaded with something that felt a lot like a dare. Sam didn't ask, "Did you find something?" or "What happens next?" Ethan knew those questions would come when they were meant to. For now, the silence between them was a thin blanket, enough to keep them from feeling alone on the long drive back. Turning down the narrow road toward the edge of town, the headlights swept over white fences, a couple of aging cars in front yards, and lawns littered with golden leaves. Out of the corner of his eye, Ethan saw Sam, still leaning against the window, gaze fixed outside, one hand quietly clutching the edge of his hoodie. Maybe just holding on to something solid in the middle of all the unseen movement beneath Clearwater's calm surface. The cold outside had teeth now, and Ethan knew it wasn't just the air. It was the chill that came from gaps in a story, from years he'd missed here, and from secrets just starting to lift their heads without showing their faces. But beside him, Sam's quiet presence was an anchor, a reminder that no matter how dark the road ahead, someone was still riding with him, not letting go. The truck eased deeper into the dark. Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel, still feeling the ghost of Sam's hand on the seat earlier. Warm, quiet, steady. Rumors began creeping through the town like early fog. No one could say where they started, only that they were there by morning. The clerk at the general store watched Ethan a beat too long when he came in for his morning coffee. The diner owner on Main dropped her voice when he walked past. Even the old mailman, who usually launched into hunting stories, turned curt, handing over the letters without a word, the smell of fresh ink and a nod he couldn't read. Within a week of seeing Evelyn, the shifts were impossible to miss. One night, after Sam had gone upstairs, Ethan stood on the porch with his hands resting on the worn rail. The streetlight cast a thin yellow pool on the empty road, and at the far corner sat a dark sedan, engine off, windows black. Nobody got out. Nobody turned the key. Just a silent presence, enough to make him feel the invisible line pulled taut between himself and that patch of shadow. He went back inside and drew the curtain. For a moment, he was back in the field, watching a flashlight beam sweep the horizon. No gunfire, just the slow squeeze of tension that weighed more than any explosion. This wasn't coincidence. Maggie caught on sooner than he'd expected. The next evening, while she stood at the sink washing dishes and he rearranged a few old notebooks on the kitchen shelf, her voice came, flat, direct, and without room to sidestep. "You're pulling Sam into this, aren't you?" He looked up, catching her eyes in the fluorescent glare, bright but cold. The water from the tap hit the plates in a steady rhythm, like a quiet alarm. He didn't answer right away. In his head, he saw again Sam's hand on the seat, and that wordless look in his eyes. Maggie dried her hands on a kitchen towel and turned to face him fully. "I don't care what you found or what you think you're going to do with it. But Sam, he's just now starting to get a little normal back since you came home. Don't take that from him." Her tone wasn't loud, but it pushed the air in the room lower, heavier. The distance between them wasn't the space of strangers. It was the space of people who'd once been close, now separated by a memory only one of them carried. He understood her fear, and he knew his own, the part he couldn't say out loud, that chasing this would dig up more than his father's past. It would pull Sam into stares, questions, and hands eager to smother the truth. Outside on the porch, the wind thudded against the wooden siding in a steady rhythm, like someone tapping from the other side of the wall. Ethan drew in a slow breath and set the notebook down on the table. "Maggie," he started, but the rest caught in his throat. She'd already turned away, rinsing the last glass in the sink. Her shoulders were a little tight, her hands moving quicker than usual, like the faster she worked, the sooner the conversation could be over. He left the kitchen and stepped back out onto the porch. The dark sedan was still there, same spot, as if it had never moved. The streetlight's glow stretched across the windshield in a long, pale stripe, and for a second, Ethan thought about his father's letters, those shaky but deliberate lines meant for him when the time comes. Maybe that time had already begun, no matter the warnings, no matter the fear now creeping into the corners of this house. Through the kitchen window, behind the thin curtain, Maggie's figure appeared. One hand rested on the sill, her eyes fixed in the direction of the car. She didn't speak, but her silence, and the silence of whoever sat inside that sedan, felt identical. The same kind of silence that carried a threat. Ethan stayed longer than he needed to, making sure that if anyone in that shadow wanted a view of the Ward house, they'd see him, not Sam. And even with a head full of questions he couldn't yet answer, one thing had crystallized. This choice, whether Maggie wanted it or not, wasn't going to be his alone anymore. The next morning, light slipped through the thin kitchen curtains, laying pale yellow streaks across the dark wood table. Ethan came down the stairs, each creak of the steps slow, weighted, almost uncertain. On the table, beside an upside-down white mug, sat a folded scrap of paper, small enough that he might have missed it if he wasn't looking. He pulled out a chair and sat, turning the paper open with one finger. Inside was only a single short line. "If Grandpa was innocent, I want to know." Sam's handwriting, slightly tilted, the strokes long, but not yet steady, like a boy's hand still carrying a bit of tremor while trying to look grown. Ethan held it in his palm, eyes lingering on the horizontal line of the word want, where the ink pressed darker than the rest, as if Sam had leaned harder on the pen when writing it. He didn't read it aloud. He just sat there, still. For a moment, the sounds of morning seemed far off, the scratchy chatter of a sparrow on the porch roof, the whir of a bicycle wheel rolling down the street, the faint tap of wind against the window. All of it outside the small circle where only he and the paper existed. Ethan set the note back on the table beside the mug, pushing it away just slightly, like he needed space to breathe. He didn't want Sam carrying more weight than he had to, but the blunt honesty of that single line was like a nail hammered in deep, firm, unshakable, and impossible to pull out without leaving a mark. On the kitchen shelf, the wall clock ticked on, the sunlight sliding slowly across the table until it touched the edge of the note. Ethan reached out, took it in hand, folded it neatly into quarters, and slid it into the pocket of his jacket. He could feel the thin paper pressing lightly against his chest with every breath, like a reminder he couldn't set down. He poured himself a cup of coffee, let it cool without drinking, his eyes drifting now and then toward the stairs, toward the place Sam had come down earlier before heading out. Maybe the boy had left the note before school, or maybe before running an errand in town. Either way, Ethan knew. Sam had already chosen to stand with the truth before even knowing where it might lead him. Maggie wasn't home that morning. Her thin jacket still hung on the hook by the door, but her rain boots were gone. The house held a different kind of quiet, as if it were waiting for something or fearing something. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, the morning wind carrying the damp scent of the fence wood and the faint sweetness from the bakery at the corner. But farther down, tucked into the darkest part of the street, he saw it again, the same dark sedan from the night before. He went back inside, took the note from his pocket, unfolded it once more. Sam's line was still there, unchanged, yet to Ethan it felt heavier than the wooden box under the apple tree. From now on, this wasn't his burden alone. Someone was watching him, not from the car, but from the eyes of his own son, waiting for an answer. He folded the note again, tucked it into his wallet, and shrugged on his coat. The front door closed behind him with a soft creak from the hinges. He stepped down from the porch, his hand curling into a loose fist. In his head, the short sentence repeated itself in time with his heartbeat. I want to know. And he understood then that, one way or another, he would have to find the answer, not just for his father, but for his boy. The files were in Caleb's old leather case, the kind with frayed corners and a scratched brass clasp, the kind that looked like it had survived a dozen winters and 100 backroom deals over coffee. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, holding the bundle of oil paper-wrapped documents, listening to Caleb's engine rumble, the smell of old gas mixing with the faint tang of cigarette smoke from his friend's coat. Neither man spoke much on the drive into town. The silence wasn't tense. It was the silence before you open a letter you've waited your whole life to read. The Clearwater Gazette sat in a 2-story brick building, its glass door etched with the paper's name. Inside, the space was crowded with wooden desks, stacks of newsprint, computers, and the sharp smell of fresh ink. Mary Whitfield, the editor-in-chief, mid-50s, silver hair pinned neatly back, looked up when they walked in. Her gaze lingered on Ethan, as if fitting him into a memory from when the ward name still stirred whispers in town. Caleb set the case on her desk, clicked the clasp. "We want you to see this," he said, voice rasped from too many late nights. Ethan said nothing, just pushed the files toward her. Yellowed papers, the original map, the photograph with the seal, laid out carefully, but carrying the weight of too many years untouched. Mary slipped on her glasses, turned each page, her finger pausing over Ward's handwriting and the seal's perfect match to the one in Evelyn's photograph. "You know what'll happen if we run this, right?" she asked, though she didn't wait for an answer. Especially with the sheriff's election coming up. Ethan only nodded. No need to explain that the timing was exactly why they were here. Truth smothered in quiet times dies in the dark. But when a town is choosing who enforces its laws, every crack in the system gets a little more light. The article was edited over 3 days, Mary checking every detail herself. By Monday morning, the front page carried a close-up photo of the 1987 municipal seal under the bold headline, "Secret beneath the Ward apple tree. Lost public land and questions left unanswered." Within hours, the coffee shop was buzzing. At the barber shop, the gas station, even the bait store, Where old men usually talk deer season, people were talking about Donnelly and the documents. The Gazette's phone rang nonstop. Praise for their courage mixed with warnings that felt anything but polite. That afternoon, Ethan was at the grocery store counter when the door swung open hard. Donnelly walked in, not in uniform, but carrying himself like he owned the air in the room. His eyes swept once, caught Ethan and stopped. A thin smile curved his lips, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Busy week, Ward," Donnelly said evenly, like they were making small talk. But under each word was a metallic weight, cold and sharp. Ethan didn't answer, just paid for his groceries, took the bag, and headed for the door. As he passed, Donnelly spoke low enough for no one else to notice. "Careful your boy doesn't get pulled in." The glass door shut behind him with the soft chime of the hanging bell. Inside his chest, Ethan's heartbeat had already lost its rhythm. The article hadn't just stirred the waters. It had woken something that had been sleeping a long time, and now it was looking straight at him. By the time night fell, heavy clouds pressed low, making the yard seem darker earlier than it should. The porch light cast a small gold circle over the gravel, and beyond that, the dark pooled thick and solid. Ethan was fixing the kitchen window screen when he heard gravel crunch under someone's steps. He stepped onto the porch. There, right on the edge of the light in the dark, stood Donnelly, long gray coat down to his knees, hands buried in his pockets. His breath curled in thin white trails in the cold air. "No griting," just one sentence, soft enough that the neighbors wouldn't hear, but carrying a weight that seemed to thicken the air around the porch. There are some things best left alone. The tone was almost gentle, but each syllable was heavy, deliberate, like a man laying down his final warning. Ethan didn't speak. He just leaned lightly against the porch post, hands hanging loose at his sides. Donnelly's shadow shifted slightly as the wind pushed through the fence slats. The porch light never reached his eyes, just the sharp line of his nose and the rigid set of his jaw. "You're walking into a swamp, Ward," he went on, voice still low, still even. "And when the water's up to your neck, no one's pulling you out." Ethan held his gaze, unblinking, as if trying to commit every contour of that face to memory. From inside the house came the soft click of a door. Sam, somewhere down the hall, had caught sight of the figure on the porch. Ethan gave the slightest tilt of his head, telling him to stay put. Donnelly didn't step closer, didn't retreat. He lingered a few more seconds, then turned away, walking toward the fence. The darkness folded over him, leaving only the crunch of his boots on the damp gravel. Ethan stayed where he was, his back against the porch post, eyes fixed on the patch of night that had swallowed him. Through the kitchen door, the ticking of the wall clock came through, steady and indifferent. He knew Donnelly hadn't just left him with a threat. It was a message. The man was already at the edges of their lives, ready to cross the threshold whenever he chose. A stray cat darted across the yard, its shadow sweeping over the porch like a thin ribbon of smoke. Ethan's fingers curled against the railing, the cold of the wood seeping into his skin. He drew a long breath, stepped back inside, slid the lock into place, but his eyes drifted again toward the fence, as if searching for the shape that had just disappeared. Sam was at the end of the hallway, his eyes asking what his mouth didn't. Ethan gave him a small nod, the kind that said it's fine, though they both knew fine had been fractured a long time ago, and tonight the crack had deepened. The courthouse sat in a squat red brick building, the courtroom itself no bigger than an old schoolroom. Harsh white lights spilled from a row of buzzing fluorescents overhead, flattening every shadow, stripping every surface of warmth. Wooden pew benches, polished to a dull sheen by years of use, bore hairline scratches like crow's feet. The air was a mix of paper, varnish, and the damp wool of coats that had been worn in the rain. In the front row, Ethan sat straight-backed, his hands clasped together, thumb running over the side of his forefinger in a small, unconscious loop, like feeling for a familiar pulse. Beside him, the wooden box rested neatly on the bench, latch long broken, its weight and stillness like the slow breathing of something alive. Before the judge's bench, a narrow table was draped in dark felt. The clerk laid out, one by one, the things the town had spent decades pretending didn't exist. The original hand-drawn map, its folds browned with age, the slanted, trembling letter from Ward's own hand, and the real municipal seal, its wooden handle darkened with time, the metal face dulled to a gray under the unforgiving lights. Each item made a small, final sound as it touched the table, like the tick of a clock stretched out too long. On the left-hand benches, Donnelly sat in his gray coat, cuffs crisp, every button in place. His lawyer leaned in, murmuring something, fingers tracing idle shapes in the air as if swiping dust away. Donnelly neither nodded nor shook his head. He only stared straight ahead, eyes like the surface of frozen water, reflecting nothing but themselves. Behind him, the heads of onlookers tipped slightly forward, the way people do when they want to hear while telling themselves they're not really listening. When the clerk called the first witness, Evelyn got to her feet. She moved slow, small frame, one hand resting lightly on the crook of her other arm the way folks do when they're aware of all the eyes on them. She set a hand on the edge of the wooden stand, like she was greeting an old friend. Her voice wasn't loud when it came, but it was clear, sharp enough you could have heard a pin drop. She talked about the records room behind Town Hall, wooden shelves, drawer cabinets, rolled-up maps tied with cloth strings. She told how Ward used to stand at the big table, hand resting beside the map, eyes tracing the red-circled lines like they were the veins of something alive. She didn't toss around heavy words, didn't accuse or condemn. She just laid out the day the seal went missing and the evening later that week when folks from the municipal office came asking to swap in a new map, a map that didn't match the one she'd kept. She spoke about a quick snapshot, Donnelly standing in front of a field when it was still a field, the seal in his hand, his eyes fixed on someone outside the frame. When that picture got passed around, there was a soft stir in the benches, like the sound of morning paper turning in a quiet kitchen. The judge gave a small nod, asked a few short questions. Evelyn answered just as short, precise, nothing added, nothing trimmed. Now, and then she paused, like reaching into a drawer in her mind, then closing it again without taking anything out because there was no need. As she stepped down, Ethan noticed one loose strand of gray slip from her bun, catching the light before disappearing into the pale background. Caleb was called next. He walked up like a guy who spent most of his life in the sun outside a garage. Solid steps, leaning forward just a touch. His voice was rough, dust from the shop still clinging to it, as he told about the time he saw men come to push Ward into signing something. He talked about that night outside his garage, Donnelly pulling up, engine still running, the smell of gas mixing with something heavier. He didn't wave his arms or play for effect. He just dropped in details like fitting the right bolt into an old thread, snug enough to hold. Someone sniffled in the back row. Over in the corner, the old ventilation fan rattled out a low, steady hum. Ethan took in every word, but he also caught the things nobody said. The flip of the clerk's notebook, the faint scuff of a shoe against the floor, the kind of cough people swallow halfway. Once, he even flinched at the sound of an ink bottle rolling a few inches and stopping on the clerk's desk. Above them, the white light never changed, never warmer, never softer. He thought of his father, alone in that records room years back, desk lamp casting a small circle of yellow, with darkness pressing in on every side. He figured the helplessness must have been just as cold as this light. Then the clerk called Sam. The boy got up from the right-hand benches, made his way forward slow. Shoulders neat inside a pale blue shirt. Hands not sure where to go, so they just hung at his sides, fingers opening and closing like he was trying to measure something he couldn't see. Ethan watched him go, saw the clean cut at the back of his neck and the collar rubbing just enough to leave a pink mark. Sam stepped up to the mic, tried speaking once, too quiet. The clerk looked up at him. He cleared his throat, lips moving, and this time his voice came out, still soft but carrying. He told about the dusty attic, the blue trunk with the loose hinges. How he opened it, found the wooden box, and picked it up with palms already damp. He spoke about the night under the apple tree, not explaining why, just laying out each move like he was describing a dream you remember so hard it hurts. I dug down, he said, and I put it there because I didn't know what to do with it, and I was scared. The word scared slipped out light as a leaf, but it landed in the room like a coin hitting the floor. He told how the next morning his dad called him out. How he dug it back up, sat on the kitchen table, and watched his dad work the rusty lock. He didn't talk about his father's hands shaking or how long his eyes stayed on the letter. Just about the smell of old paper, the EW on the envelope, and the way the morning light fell over their lives. Some sentences broke halfway through, like he didn't want to move too fast and run out of breath. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint electric buzz in the lights. Donnelly's lawyer stood once, tossed out a flat question. Why not just get it straight to your mom? Sam looked down, then back up, answered with half a sentence. Because I thought some things should go to the person who knows what they are. Nothing else. No excuses. Small enough to fit in a boy's mouth, big enough to shut a grown man up. Ethan's hands tightened, nails pressing into his palms. In his head, he kept seeing his boy standing in that cold light, voice slow and true, like someone setting stones to rebuild an old road. Loss doesn't come back with fireworks. It comes back in plain words like these. The helplessness was still there, against time, against what his father had endured, but in this dry, white room, something small was glowing on its own. No switch needed. When Sam stepped away from the mic, he passed his dad. No long look, just the lightest brush of his arm against the back of Ethan's chair. Like that night in the truck, like all those other times when words wouldn't do. Ethan didn't turn his head, but caught in the corner of his eye the small twitch at the corner of Sam's mouth. Not a smile, more like holding back something about to spill over. The clerk gathered the papers. The original map rolled and tied with frayed cloth. Ward's letter slipped into a clear sleeve. The brass seal still in the center of the table, heavy and still, like a stone pulling something hidden up from underground. In the back row, someone pulled a tissue. Near the door, a man in mud-caked boots stepped aside like he was letting a thin draft pass. The judge asked a few procedural things. The gavel came down once, short, dry, calling a recess. Folks rose slow, shoes shuffling, coughs and whispers sounding like a light rain on tin. Ethan stood last. He didn't head for his son right away. He walked to the evidence table, stopped to step back, eyes on the seal. The thing that pressed on a paper could turn a line into a border, turn a document into fate. He wondered how many times his father had touched it and what went through his mind each time. He didn't have the answer. He just knew that in the cold white light, his own breath came out in the thinnest wisp. And in that wisp, 7 years away from home, 30 years of a wrong unrighted, a lifetime of quiet, all settled into one steady inhale and exhale. By the door, Sam glanced back. He waited there, backpack strap in hand, with the patience of someone who knows the road ahead is long and isn't in a hurry. Ethan walked to him. They moved side by side into the hallway, where the light wasn't so harsh, and a narrow window let in a thin draft that carried the smell of fresh cardboard and new paper. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Everything that needed saying had been put on that table, under the cold white lights, in the slanted hand of a man long gone, in the slow voice of a boy who just found his own. The gavel came down 3 times, slow, the sound rolling through the courtroom like it was coming up from the bottom of a deep well. The judge read each word in that flat, even tone they all use, but every syllable hit Ethan with its own weight. Defendant Donnelly removed from office, effective immediately, indicted on charges of... Each phrase felt like another turn on a vice that had been clamped around his family for decades, finally loosening. There was no cheering, no backslaps, just a strange kind of silence sweeping the room. The silence you hear when a wall that's been there your whole life finally falls, and folks are still getting used to the light. Former town clerk Ward, fully exonerated. Ethan lowered his head. His back shook a little, and it wasn't from the cold. It was like standing at the edge of a field after a long, hard rain, watching the first bits of sunlight break through. He turned and saw Sam next to him, his shoulders lifting like he was carrying something new, something handed down. Ethan's calloused hand landed on his son's shoulder. No esquisse, no pull. Just a short touch, enough for Sam to know that, in this moment, they were both standing on the same side of history. In the row behind, Evelyn sat still, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes went to Ethan, then slid away toward the space between the wood-paneled wall and the window, where winter light cut in at an angle, catching tiny motes of dust that seemed unsure whether to fall or hang there. Caleb gave a small nod when their eyes met, a thin smile on his face, steady as the hum of an engine in his garage. Donnelly stood across the room, his weathered face now like a block of stone worn down by too many storms. He didn't speak or look at anyone. His lawyer leaned in and murmured something, but Donnelly just drew in a long breath and turned away. In that moment, Ethan saw the empty space between power and the person holding it, a space nobody likes to stare at. People started to leave. Shoes scuffed the floor, coats rustled. A few came to shake Ethan's hand, some just met his eyes and dipped their heads, as if apologizing for all the years they kept quiet. He answered each one with a small nod. Words weren't needed. Sam stayed put next to him, shoulders straight, eyes fixed on the judge's bench, now sitting empty. Ethan thought about that morning when Sam dug the wooden box out from under the apple tree, hands dirty, eyes steady. Now the boy was standing in a room where the truth had been read out loud like a verdict and like a release. They stepped into the hallway. The light here was warmer, gold-tinted, with the faint smell of new paper and polished wood. Through the narrow window, Ethan saw a pale gray sky, clouds spreading like ink on silver paper. Out in the front lot, a small group was gathered, talking low. The wind carried bits of it to him. Finally, over, Ward should have never. Then it all blew away like dry leaves across stone. Ethan and Sam didn't rush outside. They stood together on the courthouse steps, breathing in the air, cold, but with just enough space in it for spring to slip through. He felt Sam's hand loosen, then slide into his coat pocket, like he was keeping the warmth from that brief touch in the courtroom. A pickup rolled by, tires slicing through a puddle and leaving thin ripples behind. Ethan thought of the dirt roads in the town, the ones he'd walked when he first came back, with the smell of dry leaves and wood smoke in the air. That road felt like it had come full circle now. Not because everything was fixed, but because he knew he wouldn't be walking it alone anymore. They started down. Each wooden step groaned under them. Old sounds, the sound of stories being pulled back into daylight. In Ethan's coat pocket, the note Sam had once written about his grandfather was still there, folded neat, the edges softened for being handled so often. He knew he'd keep it, not as evidence, but as a marker for the day they'd both stepped toward the truth. At the bottom, Sam stopped and looked up at him. No questions, no words. Ethan smiled and put his hand on his son's shoulder again, this time letting it stay, letting it warm. Behind them, the courthouse door swung shut, the hinge letting out a soft creak like the period at the end of an old story. Ahead, the road stretched out, not smooth but wider, brighter, and most important, one they'd walk together. They came back towards Old House on a late winter morning, fog still hanging in the trees like a blanket that didn't want to lift. The place sat quiet on its rise, the white paint faded, a few porch boards curling up under the years. Ethan opened the door, the hinges giving a faint whine, and the air inside carried that mix of old timber and long-dead fires, like the house had been holding its breath, waiting for them to finish a story left undone. Maggie wasn't there. In the days after the trial, she'd packed neat into 3 cardboard boxes and left town without a scene. No accusations, no last fight. Just one afternoon, when Ethan came back from Caleb's garage, he saw her car take the last turn out of sight. Sam had watched from the window, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, not asking a thing. Ethan knew there are goodbyes that don't need explanations, because no explanation could change the fact that 2 people had been standing on opposite banks for too long. Sam took the small back bedroom, the one with a window facing the old apple tree. The tree was bare now, stripped after fall, its branches like old hands reaching into the cold sky. That first afternoon, he brought out a shovel and hoe, working the soil around its roots. Not digging deep, just loosening the ground, letting the air in after winter's wait. Ethan leaned on the porch post, watching his boy's shadow bend under the branches. When the day was fading, Sam swept the dead leaves from the base of the tree and set a flat stone right over the spot where the wooden box had once been buried. No carving, no mark but its square edges. He said it was to keep the ground in place, but Ethan understood. It was his way of saying that some memories are meant to stay right where they belong, neither forgotten nor disturbed. Inside the house, Ethan set about putting Ward's old desk back in order. The man had left things arranged with the kind of care that felt like a lesson. Neatly stacked files, a heavy fountain pen, a pair of reading glasses with a scratched lens. Ethan wiped out each drawer, then placed the note Sam had once written, "If Grandpa was innocent, I want to know," into a small wooden box alongside the old pocket watch. He didn't tell Sam, but he figured one day, when the boy opened it, he'd understand why his father kept those 2 things side by side. That first night, the wind slid through the cracks in the doorframe, carrying the dry rustle of the last leaves in the yard. Lying there, Ethan felt both hollow and at peace. Hollow because part of the family was gone. At peace because part of it had stayed, enough for him to know he wasn't alone anymore. In the next room, Sam slept with the door pulled to, a thin strip of gold light spilling across the wood floor. The next morning, when Ethan came into the kitchen, Sam was already outside with a small watering can, moving slow and steady around the base of the apple tree. Early light ran down the shoulders of his coat, catching in his dark hair. Ethan didn't call out. He just sat on the porch step, letting the heat from his coffee seep into his hands. A sparrow shot up from a branch, its brief chatter fading fast. Ethan followed it with his eyes, realizing what eased his chest wasn't the courtroom victory, but the sight right in front of him. A young man tending a patch of ground that had once hidden the past, now turning it into something to keep and nurture. In that moment, he understood. What's gone can't be brought back, and what's left will change whether you want it to or not. But meaning, you can find that again. Sometimes it's as simple as honoring a tree, a patch of dirt, and the hands willing to dig for truth or gently put the soil back for the sake of peace. Autumn settled in like a slow breath, with a mild chill that made you fold your collar in a little closer. The sun slanted down from the ridge, filtering through the apple tree's bare branches, catching gold on the lighter strands of Sam's hair. The wind stirred what few leaves still clung on, sending them drifting in slow spirals to the ground. Ethan stood next to his son, hands deep in his coat pockets, saying nothing. The apple tree in front of them showed no sign of what had once been buried beneath it. The earth was smooth now, the small stones still in place, wearing a thin skin of green moss. Each gust carried the mix of damp soil, decaying leaves, and the faint, dry scent of grass from the open lot out back. Sam bent and picked up a bright yellow leaf, turned it in his fingers for a few seconds, then set it on the stone. No words, but Ethan knew he was thinking of his grandfather, a man he only knew from scattered stories and a case that had cast a shadow for decades. They'd cleared the man's name, but no one could give back the years stolen from him. A sudden gust lifted the leaf, spun it, and carried it past the fence. Ethan watched it go, thinking how much of life was just like that, things you try to hold on to slipping away without warning. He let out a slow breath, eyes tracking the rest of the leaves breaking free, and the question he kept locked inside rose again. Forgiveness. Sometimes it's harder than finding the truth. He'd faced people who denied, dodged, even threatened. He'd pushed all the way until the truth was out. And now, with the papers signed and the case closed, all that was left was a space he didn't quite know how to name. Because forgiveness isn't just for someone else. It's for yourself, too, to let go of the bitterness that's kept you pinned down. Ethan knew that with Maggie, with the ones who turn away, forgiveness would be a longer road than finding any piece of evidence. And maybe he'd never walk it all the way. Sam stayed there beside him, not asking, letting the quiet between them be filled by the rustle of leaves and the slow beat of a steady heart. Since moving back here, Ethan had learned to leave silences alone, not to crowd them with words. Sometimes it's the quiet that shows you what's really still here. The sun slid down toward the horizon, laying a band of gold orange across the apple tree's trunk, showing every knot and crack that had weathered so many storms. Ethan reached out and ran his fingers over the bark. Rough, solid, a reminder that strength isn't about never being hurt. It's about still standing after you've taken the hits. He turned to look at Sam. The boy was gazing down the road toward the small houses with their porch lights on, thin chimney, smoke curling into the evening. That simple, still scene made Ethan think. They found a piece of life's meaning again, not through winning, but by valuing what was left after the storm. The wind came back, carrying the long, low call of a train from somewhere far off. It was soft, and it carried the kind of sadness you find in old memories. Ethan shut his eyes for a second, and the question came again, this time not just for him. If it were you, which way would you go? Forgive, to lighten your own heart, even if the other person never says they're sorry? Or hold on to the truth like a shield, so no one can cut you again? When he opened his eyes, Sam was still there, his hand resting on the flat stone like he was keeping an invisible promise. And Ethan knew, whatever the answer was, it wouldn't come today. But here, under this apple tree, they could look for it together, slowly, season by season. Maybe everyone who comes home from war carries a piece of emptiness no one else can see, a place where memory and the present knock against each other, leaving edges that cut and soften at the same time. For Ethan, the road home wasn't just from the bus station towards Old House. It was a walk through loss, through helplessness, and then learning how to find meaning again. The old apple tree still stood, having watched secrets buried, unearthed, and finally kept as part of memory. The town would go on, the autumn leaves would keep falling, but in a small house on the hillside, a father and son were still learning, at their own pace, how to love and how to forgive. There's no one right answer for everyone. Some things you let go, some you hold on to, and sometimes the most important thing is knowing there's still someone willing to stand under the same tree with you, in silence, without feeling alone. If you've ever gone back to a place or a person and found everything had changed, what would you do? Hold tight to the memory or learn to forgive? I'll listen to your story the way we've always listened here, slowly, long enough so no one feels left behind.